I call to order this hearing of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Europe, Eurasia, and Emerging Threats. Today's topic is the threat of China's unsafe consumables, an emerging threat. After the ranking members and I each take our 5 minutes to make opening remarks, each member present will have 1 minute to make some opening remarks as well, alternating between majority and minority members, and without objection, all members will have 5 days to submit statements, questions, extraneous material for the record. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Well, who could forget that agricultural interests were the driving force behind various trading and trade expanding understandings that our country has had with the Communist Chinese regime in Beijing. Who would have thought that the People's Republic of China would become a significant food exporter, especially of fruits, vegetables, seafood, and dairy products? And the farming community, the agricultural industry, put so much effort because they just saw this as a market for their goods. Never did they consider that these would be competitors, and competitors that did not have to meet the same standards that they have. Chinese industry has also become a major producer of drugs and chemicals used in both medicine and food processing, and yes, and in manufacturing as well. Thus, the health and safety not only of the United States and Europe, but that of people around the world has become dependent on the quality of goods imported from China. Yet the task of inspecting and testing Chinese goods is beyond the ability of governments, considering the magnitude of that challenge. It's beyond their ability to do a good job, or at least that's what I'm suggesting. We'll hear from our witnesses what they think about that. Astonishingly, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration inspects less than 2% of the food imports from China. This is a major security concern. And why? Because the record of Chinese quality in their food production is extremely poor. Indeed, CNN reported Monday that poultry workers moving to and from wet markets and farms may be responsible for the spread of the deadly H7N9 virus in China. Read that, the bird flu virus. We import poultry now to feed animals, but the FDA may soon approve the importation of Chinese poultry for human consumption. Now, does this move make sense at all? Ronald Reagan once said of the Soviet Union, "Trust but verify." In regards to Communist China, however, we cannot trust, nor can we verify. Chinese producers are motivated to cut corners, dilute content, counterfeit products to maximize profits, and keep prices so low as to dominate export markets. Chinese supervision and regulation is weak and corrupt. We have the irony of a communist system that has spawned the most predatory capitalism of all. The result is food that makes you sick and drugs that will not make you well and could well kill you. Even the state-owned media knows the problem. Last October, China Daily cited a marketing survey which found, and I quote, "Food safety is a top concern for Chinese shoppers, especially regarding such produce as vegetables, meat, seafood, grain, cooking oils, and dairy goods," end of quote. If this is true within China, then it should also be true for foreign markets. And a series of scandals involving toxic chemicals and other fillers in food products around the world confirm this. Yet, Chinese agricultural exports continue to increase, driven by their low prices. The same is true in the pharmaceutical industry. there has been movement, again, unexpected, of much of that industry from the United States to China. Just like in the agricultural area, we saw a whole industry shift over to China that was never predicted by agriculture. Well, it also hasn't been predicted by the pharmaceutical industry. Beijing has been allowed, for example, to join the World Trade Organization, which helped this shift. This shift was motivated by a desire to cut costs by using cheap Chinese labor and by avoiding expensive regulation. This opened the door not only to lower quality output, but made it easier for counterfeiters to infiltrate the supply side and supply chains of our pharmaceutical products. Drugs with weak dosages or no active ingredients at all endanger public health and discredit treatment programs. Fake drugs undermine U.S. efforts to treat illnesses in developing countries. For example, the State Department has requested $650 million in 2014 to fight malaria in developing countries. Yet half that anti-malaria drugs that are on the market in South Asia and Africa have been found to be counterfeit. And most of these fake drugs come from where? China. Fakes also threatened the campaign against diabetes and other significant and debilitating diseases. Beside the global health, safety, and security threats created by unscrupulous Chinese business practices and the corrupt lack of supervision by Chinese authorities, there is a competitive issue as well. American farmers are the most productive in the world and are held to rigorous standards. The same is true of the American pharmaceutical industry, which creates the world's most advanced medicines. Yet, if the U.S. exports are defeated in the marketplace on the basis of lower prices stemming from illicit cost-cutting, then the American producer, as well as our entire economy, will suffer. Counterfeit products are often sold under the brand name of the legitimate product, such as Pfizer or Lipitor or several others. Indeed, there has been, and there is hardly an American company that has not been victimized by this Chinese larceny. And when the product does not work, the brand is held responsible. But yet it's not the people at that company that's been making the product. It's a knockoff by some Chinese company that has been permitted to do so by the Chinese authorities that should be enforcing the rule of law. Now, if you end up having a Chinese company under the name of another company, an American company or whatever, what we've done is we have slandered the name of an American company, and we have slandered the ability of the people of the United States and our system as well, because we have basically been, at that point, saying to the world, this is what our products are like, when it isn't our product. This is something we've got to stop if we're going to maintain the integrity and the trust that the people around the world have in American products. Not to mention, we've got to stop it because there are people who are being injured and killed because they're using these phony products that are being manufactured by someone else other than who is on the label. Are there measures we can take or persuade China not to do certain things, or are there things that China can be persuaded to do to safeguard consumers from dangerous exports? Or what steps can we make? Or should we just ban all such goods from China from the marketplace because they're inherently unsafe? Well, that's a question we'll have to talk about today. The production and distribution of such critical goods as food and medicine, upon which life itself depends, cannot be trusted unless there is integrity throughout the manufacturing and supply chains. We have gathered this panel of experts to help us decide what the policy options are. With that, Mr. Keating, would you have an opening statement?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding today's hearings. From tires to toothpaste to toys, Chinese imports account for more than 50% of the recalls announced by the Consumer Product Safety Commission. And China's monetary policies do not make it any easier for safer American-made products to compete with their cheaper Chinese counterparts. Ultimately, China's policies affect the safety of our children, our parents, grandparents, and pets here at home. Increasingly, the conversation in Congress has turned to China as a rising superpower that is increasingly investing in emerging markets worldwide. But the fact of the matter is that China still lacks the necessary governmental institutions based in rule of law, transparency, and accountability to be able to regulate its own products. Further, these institutional weaknesses extend to the realm of human rights abuses and media repression within China. During the 2008 Olympic Games in China, an official ban on reporting, quote, all food safety issues, unquote, banned media from reporting on at least 20 dairy firms that were selling milk products that contained the chemical melamine. That cover-up contributed to the deaths of 6 children and the illnesses among 300,000 others. And when Chinese officials attempted to enforce regulations, which they have been doing as of late, their institutional weaknesses come back to haunt them. Just this year, in response to a campaign to crack down on marketing sick pigs in China, the Ministry of Public Security has been raiding farms, arresting violators, and then confiscating unsafe pork meat. According to the Council on Foreign Relations, during the celebration of the Lunar Chinese New Year this year, the police stepped up efforts to rid the market of tainted pork meat. However, in absence of collaboration from other departments, these well-intended efforts led to over 6,000 unmarketable dead pigs being dumped into a local river. Thousands of carcasses were discovered floating in the Wangpu River, which supplies drinking water to Shanghai's 23 million residents. The domestic implications for this huge and incredibly concerning practice are yet to be fully understood. There are international implications as well. According to the same Council on Foreign Relations report, in 2011 alone, China produced more than 50 million metric tons of pork, accounting for nearly half the worldwide pork production. And unfortunately, we can easily list other instances like this throughout China, as well as one recall after another for Chinese products in our own country here at home. For this reason, and the fact that China has been extending operations into developing regions of the world with even weaker standards, I do agree with you that China's unsafe products have the potential to become an even more widespread threat to global health and global safety. I hope that today's hearing can shed some light as to why and which way we can proceed as a country to really protect our consumers at home and protect consumers throughout the world. I welcome our witnesses and look forward to their testimonies. And with that, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Yeah, thank you for that very provocative opening statement. Gives new meaning to sweet and sour pork, you might say. Steve, that should have been your line. We now recognize Steve Stockman, the outspoken member of our committee from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You're great. I'm glad you put this committee together. We have in our district rice, catfish, and pharmaceuticals, and you can trust ours and our labeling. And someone that buys organic food and appreciates organic food, and now finding that the society which professes to be socialist and caring and not driven by greed is actually driven by greed and mislabels organic food and other products. It's very Orwellian, I guess, to say the least. And I thank you for holding these hearings, and I'm looking forward to the testimonies of our guests today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And yeah, that is it is very ironic that for all of these years the communists were talking about how horrible free enterprise and capitalism is. And here they have, they turned their back in their own country while they still have a government that claims to allegiance to Marx and Lenin, and they just turned their back on this most predatory and awful example of irresponsibility in the name of making a profit. So now today we have 4 witnesses, and what I'm going to do is introduce all 4 now, and then we will each have about 5 minutes to give your presentation. Anything more than that, we're happy to put in the record, and then we will have some questions and answers. First, we have William Triplett. He's an author and consultant with great experience with China. You've been a consultant for over 4 decades now. Mr. Triplett began his professional career with the American intelligence community, working China issues overseas. Later, he was the Deputy Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for the East-West, meaning China, during the first Reagan administration. He served for 9 years on the staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, reaching the post of Chief Republican Counsel to the committee. His most recent of several books is Bowing to Beijing, published last year, and he is a frequent contributor to newspapers and professional journals. We also have with us Patty Lovera, and she is the Assistant Director of the nonprofit Food and Water Watch, where she coordinates the organization's food policy program. She has a bachelor's degree in environmental science and a master's degree in environmental policy from the University of Michigan. Before joining the Food and Water Watch, she was a deputy director of the Energy and Environment Program at Public Citizen and a researcher at the Center for Health, Environment, and Justice. We have with us also Mark Castel, and is co-founder of, Cornucopia, I got it right, Institute, a foreign policy research group based in Wisconsin, and director of its Organic Integrity Project. For almost 20 years prior to the launch of this institute, he was president of M.A. Castel and Associates, a professional practice that included political consulting, lobbying, business development work, and benefiting family-scale farmers. Finally, Sophie Richardson is the China director at the Human Rights Watch, a graduate of the University of Virginia, the Hopkins Nanjing Program, and Oberlin College. Dr. Richardson is the author of numerous articles on domestic Chinese political reform, democratization, and human rights in Cambodia, China, Indonesia, Hong Kong, and the Philippines, and Vietnam. Her book, China, Cambodia, and the 5 Principles of Peaceful Coexistence, was published by Columbia University Press and is an in-depth examination of China's foreign policy since the 1954 Geneva Conference. With that said, we have our witnesses with us today, and we will start with Mr. Castel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Mark Allen Castel. I'm the co-director and senior farm policy analyst of the Cornucopia Institute. We're based in Cornucopia, Wisconsin. Cornucopia is a tax-exempt farm policy research group. We act as an organic industry watchdog. We've long been concerned about the propriety of organic commodities and finished products being imported into the United States from China. Mr. Chairman, many in this country, for good reason, based on history, do not trust the Chinese to supply ingredients for our dog and our cat food. Why should we trust these Chinese exporters with food that we are feeding our children and our families? Besides for any specific concerns and evidence regarding organics, this country is a country with endemic levels of commercial fraud, whether in intellectual property, the counterfeiting of name brand consumer products, or being engaged in industrial espionage. The organic marketplace was founded as an ethical alternative for consumers seeking safer and more nutritious food to serve their families. We looked at Chinese organics as part of our research and investigation in preparing our report Behind the Bean. We found that although there were many exemplary U.S. manufacturers, the majority of the participants in the organic soy industry were shifting to Chinese organic imports. In particular, we highlighted Dean Foods' White Wave division, which manufactures the market leader Silk soy milk. They threw U.S. organic producers under the bus by asking them to match cheaper Chinese prices, which they were unable to do. In Cornucopia's 2009 Soy Foods report, we estimated that as much as half of all organic soybeans being sold in the United States came from overseas, primarily China. It's probably higher now. We were told by domestic soybean buyers and processors of food-grade soybeans that brokers came to them with a choice. They had A beans and B beans. What's the difference? The brokers told us that the A beans were from farms and suppliers they had personally visited in China, and they could vouch for the authenticity of the product. And the B beans? Well, the brokers had a piece of paper, a certification document that says they're organic, and they're cheaper. Most commonly, we found that the ones that got purchased were the B beans. In February 2011, the USDA's National Organic Program started informing the public of fraudulent organic certificates, these pieces of paper that I referenced. They found that 22 fraudulent organic certificates since that point in time, 9 were from China. The next highest country, only 3 were from India, where we're also seeing an exponential increase in organic imports. And whether it's melamine contaminating processed food, rat meat masquerading as lamb, or dead hogs floating down that river you referenced, we don't trust, the Chinese don't trust the food they are producing. Why should we? The USDA and FDA inspectors are only examining, as referenced, 1% to 2% of all food that reaches U.S. ports. And what are they finding? A disproportionate number of serious problems from China: adulteration, unapproved chemicals, dyes, pesticides, and outright fraud, fake food. The remaining 98% that's not inspected, well, that might be on your table tonight for dinner or at the restaurant you might be enjoying. The largest organic farmer cooperative in this country, Organic Valley, is now exporting packaged milk to China. You can understand why a growing, affluent cross-section of the Chinese populace is buying imported U.S. commodities. What do they know that many in the United States don't know about the safety of Chinese food? The farmers I work for have names, and they have a story, and they have a background, and they're competing with these pieces of paper. Organics continue to grow even in this tight economy, but for the first time, we are seeing a net loss in the number of organic farmers in the Midwest and Rocky Mountain states, and we're losing thousands of acres of farmland. We can't compete with the Chinese without a level playing field in terms of aggressive certification and enforcement of organic law. In conclusion, the Cornucopia Institute welcomes congressional pressure on the FDA and USDA to fulfill their mandates to protect domestic farmers, organic consumers, and all consumers from the dangerous fraud in the importation of food from China, India, former Soviet bloc states, or any other country exporting poison to our shores. And we hope that you folks will adequately augment their budget and watchdog them to make sure they're carrying out their missions. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. That was very thoughtful, and we'll have some questions. Mr. Triplett.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and distinguished ranking member. I'm William C. Triplett, II, and with the committee's permission, I would like my prepared statement put in the record, and I will speak just briefly off the cuff.
Certainly with no objection, thank you.
Last week, they had a lot of fun with the rat meat story that was in the newspaper and on headlines and so forth. And a Chinese Supreme Court judge was quoted, "The situation is really grave and has indeed caused great harm to the people," unquote. Certainly, he's certainly he's right. And he's talking about the Chinese people, but the obvious problem is that stuff comes to us too. And there's three items, or three ways we can look at it. One is the adulterated food issue. The second one is their deficient health system. And the third one, which I'd like to talk about a little bit, is pollution for you, for thee, but not for me. One of the things we've known for a long time is that the Chinese cadres had their own farms. They don't trust the food and so forth and so on. That's number one. Number two, the farmers themselves don't trust their own food. They won't eat what they produce, so they ship it to another province. Rich people are leaving the country, and in the exit interviews, they're being asked, why are you leaving? And the answer is because of food safety and so forth and so on. One of the other things is Chinese communist officials even have special filters on the buildings that they work in, so that they don't have to breathe the foul air. Now, the issue of, is this becoming our problem? I have a graph in the prepared statement that shows that in the last 3 years, Chinese agricultural imports are going up by about $500 million a year. That's the first graph. And of course, imports of poultry are going up even at a higher rate. The question is, can the Chinese solve the problem on their own? I don't think that I know anybody who studies this closely who really thinks the Chinese can handle it themselves. I think that the system is simply too corrupt, and I think we're going to hear that from several of the witnesses today, and so forth and so on. I'd like to turn to what the Congress and the committee can do about it. And first and foremost, I want to commend the committee for holding this hearing. That's the alpha, if you will, of the alpha and omega of solutions. Because without this kind of a hearing, then this issue will get lost with the other issues. Now, the second end of the issue is this is the omega, and that is when China becomes a democratic country, then the people will demand safe food, and safe food for them will then ultimately mean safe food for us. So we're between these two ends. The question is what to do in the middle. I have a lot of experience, as the chairman well knows, in arms smuggling of Chinese to terrorist countries and groups and so forth and so on. Smuggling is a real big deal. I would hope the committee would encourage the usual suspects to find out basically who is involved, who are the names, who are the corrupt officials and so forth and so on who are engaged in this food safety business. That's the first thing. That is, take names. Second thing is I think we need to change the terms of reference. New York Times today had a big story about how we need $3 billion more for food inspection. I'm generally sympathetic with that, but on the other hand, if you look at the honey case, I'm not sure how much money would be sufficient, and I think the onus should go the other direction, and that is the Chinese should basically guarantee that their food is safe. The other thing is a question of draconian punishments. The Congress has a history of imposing draconian punishments, the Toshiba case being the most famous example. And also this committee has jurisdiction over the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. And sixth, I have included something called the Strategic Policy Framework, which was circulated in the last Congress and is essentially a way to organize looking at Chinese issues from a comprehensive standpoint. So if you put the three together, take names, that's number one. Number two, change the terms of reference. Number three, begin to talk about really draconian measures against some of the people who are engaged in this, and then do this all in a comprehensive way. I think that would be the best of my suggestions. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak.
And Ms. Lovera.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Patty Lovera, and I'm the Assistant Director of Food and Water Watch. We're a nonprofit consumer advocacy organization, and we appreciate the opportunity to present testimony on this important topic. As we've discussed, the United States is increasingly reliant on imported food, and China is in the position as the world's largest agricultural economy to send us a lot of the food that we're importing. We import over 1 billion pounds of fruits and vegetables from China every year, and over 1 billion pounds of fish and seafood. For some products, like apple juice and garlic, China has already started to replace domestic production of crops that we have traditionally grown here. In 2000, and it's not just fresh produce or even fruits and vegetables and seafood. We're increasingly bringing in processed foods and the ingredients that we use in processed foods. In 2010, we imported 81 million pounds of spices and 41 million pounds of pasta and baked goods from China. I've included some charts with a lot more data on these trends in the written testimony that I submitted. Food safety problems in China have obviously been making headlines for a while. We spoke already about contamination of foods with melamine. The one point I will add to the melamine story is why melamine was in the food. So melamine is an ingredient in plastics, and it's been intentionally added to these food products to try to artificially increase the nitrogen content in those foods to attempt to beat laboratory tests for protein levels. So this was not an accidental contamination. This was intentional adulteration with an economic motive to try to beat laboratory tests. So despite very public efforts in recent years by the Chinese government to crack down on food safety problems, it's kind of a continual feed of bad news from the food safety front from China. We've heard a lot of these examples already. I do want to spend a minute talking about what our government is doing in terms of protecting U.S. consumers with our oversight of these imports. We've already heard that the FDA can inspect less than 2% of imported produce, processed food, and seafood, which we think almost guarantees that some unsafe Chinese products are going to make their way onto our store shelves. The FDA opened its first office in China in 2008. However, the few FDA inspectors in China are overwhelmed by the sheer size of the nation's food production, including an estimated 1 million food processing companies. In fiscal year 2012, FDA conducted 10 inspections of food facilities in China. When it comes to meat and poultry imports, that's the responsibility of the Department of Agriculture. And we are not yet importing meat and poultry for human consumption from China, but that process is underway. And we're concerned about the way that USDA is regulating imports of these products from other countries and what that will mean if China does get approved. The USDA recently announced in 2009 that it made a major change to its oversight of imports by ending annual in-depth audit visits it would make to exporting countries. Now they're relying on a self-reporting tool for countries as a substitute. And that means they're going to do those audit visits every 3 years instead of annually. So if we reach a point, and the process is ongoing now, where China gets approved as equivalent to send processed chicken products here, we worry that that's the process the USDA will use, and that's clearly not sufficient. Just a few recommendations that we would have about what we can be doing on the U.S. front to protect consumers from this situation. We think in the big picture, it's really important to think about that this is not an unforeseeable outcome. This is not an accident. We're combining trade policy that makes the U.S. more and more reliant on importing food with a food safety regulatory system that's not up to the job of dealing with that rising tide of imports. So in addition to examining our trade policy, we think we also need to really take a hard look at the changes we need to make to our food safety programs. So specifically, we think the USDA should conduct an entirely new investigation before allowing Chinese poultry products to be exported to the United States. If these imports are approved, USDA should permanently assign inspection personnel to China so that the exporting plants receive regular visits by USDA inspectors. When it comes to the FDA, they need the resources to conduct more inspections in food facilities in China rather than relying on third-party certifications of the safety practices used by exporting firms. So this is a model that's being proposed under new food safety legislation that would make the FDA very reliant on using third parties to verify that food from other countries is safe. We don't think that's adequate for U.S. consumers. It's the government's job to do these safety inspections, so we're quite concerned about that. And then finally, consumers do have one tool right now to protect themselves, which is country of origin labeling, which is mandatory thanks to federal law. It covers meat, seafood, fruits and vegetables, and some nuts. but there are problems in the coverage of that labeling program because of the way that USDA has defined the word processed. The law says processed foods don't get a label. USDA wrote an incredibly broad definition of processed, so a lot of forms of these foods that should be covered are not required to have a label. So we think that USDA should change that definition so consumers get more coverage of the country of origin label. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Richardson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the members of the subcommittee for holding this timely
We're going to need you a
discussion.
little closer to the mic or whatever we can do there, because
How's that?
that's great.
In Human Rights Watch's view, the integrity of products made in China, whether they're for domestic consumption or for export, is directly related to the government's respect for the freedom of expression, access to information, and the independence of the legal system. In other words, the lack of protections, the lack of upholding these particular rights makes it extremely difficult to ensure whether products are safe, whether products are what they say they are, or whether consumers here or there have any means of real effective redress. In one particularly telling example of the Chinese government's choice to suppress information, as Mr. Keating referred to in his opening remarks, Chinese journalists were ready in the early summer of 2008 to report the melamine scandal. But because of the ban on bad news in the run-up to the 2008 Olympics, those journalists were not allowed to report that story until much later in the year, by which point 300,000 kids had gotten sick and at least 6 had died. So the government was perfectly willing to suppress news, even that which posed a clear public safety threat. It's also worth noting that in November of 2010, a Beijing court sentenced a man named Zhao Lianhai to 2.5 years in prison on charges of causing a public disturbance, which we found a particularly ironic description for the actions of a man who, in the face of his own child's melamine-induced illness, had sought to organize other parents to file a class action lawsuit. And even now, 5 years later, it's not hard to find newspaper articles about Chinese consumers either going abroad specifically for the purpose of or incidental to outside travel, purchasing baby milk formula because concerns about those products still run so deep. To us, it's of equal concern the range of issues on which the Chinese domestic press and the international press continue to be prevented from reporting in a timely manner, whether it's about chemical spills, infectious disease outbreaks, or public unrest in response to environmental problems. This puts all of us at risk. I think the problems aren't just a question of what does or doesn't make it into a newspaper or what products make it into an export stream, but also about what kinds of information ordinary people inside China can have access to. I asked to have submitted into the record a report we wrote in 2011 about the lead poisoning of children in 4 provinces in China. These were children of people who either worked in battery factories or lived near facilities that processed products made with lead. None of those facilities operated in compliance with domestic laws on health and safety obligations. Many of them were operating in violation of close-down orders. Several of them had been fined but paid the fines and continued to operate. And we think this was largely a result of the commingling of economic and political interests in those areas. That's a common dynamic across the country. Parents of sick children were repeatedly thwarted, not only in their efforts to get accurate tests. Parents told us repeatedly about being given falsified test results. Parents who went to the provincial capital to file complaints or try to file lawsuits were turned back. Some of them were in fact arrested, essentially in pursuit of simply trying to get accurate diagnoses and some sort of compensation or assistance for their gravely ill children. I think it is the case that while there are more regulations and rhetoric now, particularly coming out of the new leadership about pollution and about public health, it's very hard to see how those have become actionable tools for people to get educated, get help, or hold officials or companies to account. On the question of what remains to be done, clearly, and many people at this table are much better equipped to talk about the regulatory regimes and what fixes there need to be taken than I am. But this is obviously, I think, consistent with, for example, ICE's problems in even accessing the facilities to check for prison-made goods in China. There's a long history of the challenges of inspections inside the country. But I think it's also not just a question of regulation or inspection regimes. there are larger issues about information and freedom of expression at stake, and I think it's not just up to the State Department or specific cabinet members to raise those issues. I think it's very clear that for the FDA, for other agencies to talk about access to information and freedom of expression in China is now more meaningful than it ever has been in the past. I also think there's a lot of room for U.S. officials from a variety of agencies to take these issues up with counterparts other than the Foreign Ministry or the Ministry of Health, such as the Supreme Court or the Public Security Bureau. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Thank all of you for beginning this discussion. It is the chair's intention to let Mr. Keating, the ranking member, go first in the questions, and then Mr. Stockman from Texas, and then I think they call it in baseball, clean up.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just had a thought listening to you, Ms. Richardson, that in the absence of the media being able to disclose things, what effect, if any, has the social media been able to do to get the word out to Chinese people that there are dangers in their food, and specifically when these instances occur and there's illness attached, to alert people in that respect? Has it been helpful in that way?
Certainly, it's an incredibly powerful tool for alerting to people to specifically which kinds of products or which companies' products are problematic. At the same time, first of all, social media is subject to the same kinds of censorship the official print media is, or electronic media. And so sometimes that information is quashed fairly quickly. I don't have a lot of specific research to point to this, but it's also become more common in the last 4 or 5 years for journalists and even sort of citizen journalists to be charged with spreading rumors. There's actually a specified, it's considered an administrative violation rather than a criminal one, but I think it makes some people nervous about sharing information that could be construed as reporting a rumor rather than a fact.
Okay. Mr. Triplett, you mentioned the effects of this on America's business community here at home. Could you comment, and any of our panelists, on how it affects America's interest from a business perspective abroad, with us trying to do business abroad?
Yes, sir. Of course, we know that the Chinese are the biggest counterfeiters in the world, and so it's one thing to counterfeit something and make it work right and so forth and so on. But if you make something that is in fact poisonous, then you damage the brand of the American firm as well. I think that is a whole wider issue that you can get into, and that gets into things besides consumables as well. There have been rumors for years about the Chinese having UL labels that were faked, and so somebody thinks abroad. Let's say you see something that's made in the United States has a UL label on it, and if it's possibly faked by the Chinese, then obviously you lose business all the way around. It's part of the whole larger thing, which is one of the reasons why I'm suggesting that the committee return to the idea of a comprehensive approach to the various kinds of Chinese problems. You all had hearings on Chinese cyber terrorism, correct? And so that's an issue. Food safety is an issue. Arms smuggling, I would argue, is an issue, and so forth and so on. And to the extent that the Congress can look at this comprehensively, I think that's probably a good idea. Thank you.
To any of our panelists, Chinese officials have been making some attempts to increase regulation and enforcement targeting polluting factories. Have these attempts been making a difference at all in addressing the urgent and long-term health consequences associated with the levels of lead seen in villages like Henan and Yunnan, Shanxi, and Hunan? Those kind of villages, there's reports that there's lead, polluting those villages. And are any of you aware of the efforts they're making on trying to regulate this kind of pollution, if they're effective at all?
I'm not familiar as specifically with lead programs, but I mean, when we look at food safety stories and we're trying to track what's coming out of China, it does appear that there's a kind of a broad attempt to really put on, a very public effort to crack down on problems. There's something often in the news about, the crackdown on this. Last week it was fake meat. It's pretty constant. I mean, one of the issues when you're talking about something that's as pervasive as entire villages, being contaminated, the question is then where are you going to grow the food? The lead's not going to just go away because they deal with the polluting factor. It's in the soil. What I can speak to the best is that we don't have a regulatory system here to know what province or let alone village a product would come from if it was shipped here, and we don't really have a system that's going to very often do a lab test to look for lead levels. We tend to find that kind of thing when there's a problem and work backwards and then find the source. We're not intercepting things when they're coming into the U.S.
I just had a question. Oh, go ahead.
I would just add to that a couple of points. I mean, shortly after we released this report about lead poisoning, there was an announcement by the Ministry of Environment that about 500 battery-producing factories were going to be shut down. We have tried to track that over the years to see if they actually were shut down, if they stayed shut down, if in fact they reopened, whether the necessary protective practices had been put in place, and it's extremely difficult to discern whether that's actually happened. I mean, and look, we see this on lots of different issues. A problem reaches a certain level of publicity inside China. The government says we're going to crack down on it, and a year later, we're having exactly the same conversation. But I think it is. I do also want to pick up on the point that Ms. Lovera just made, because when we were doing this research, we were also trying to figure out if any of the batteries that were being produced in these factories actually were turning up in the U.S. or were being on-sold into an export chain, and it was either going from the China end to here or going from here backwards. It was almost impossible to figure out. We didn't have the resources to try to track the products along the way. So for all I know, products that got made in these very factories wound up here. But we should be able to know that. We should be able to figure that out more easily, I think.
Good. Thank you. And I yield back, Mr.
Thank you. And we now have Mr. Stockman. You may
Yeah,
proceed.
I have a question. First of all, I expected Diane Sawyer or someone from ABC, NBC, CBS, anybody to cover this. This is a national problem. My question for you, first off, is if we publicize your names and make some of the statements, some of the frustrations I get when I'm on a committee, I'll reiterate some of the things and I'm not saying you have done this, but then the press calls up and they say, well, that's not exactly what we said. I think this is very alarming, what we're hearing today, and had another nation or other nations done this, I think many people would view it almost as an act of war. And what's alarming, Ms. Richardson, your statement that they allowed their own citizens to die so they could have a good face on the Olympics, and that they're willing to sacrifice their own children for the purpose of national pride. I don't think then that we fall anywhere near their own children. So I don't see how their concerns, what I'm saying is they don't seem to care about their own kids. Why would they care about us? And they can't run their own food program, but they're somehow going to have compassion for us. That's just simply not true. I was wondering, Mark, which company, is Walmart one of the ones that imports the most Chinese food for their groceries, do you know?
It's really across the board. The organic industry has been the subject of a corporate takeover, so to speak, through mergers and acquisitions. So most of the major name brands are controlled by familiar agribusinesses like Dean Foods and General Mills and Kraft and Smuckers.
Have you gone to those farms that claim organic in China?
No.
Would they let you come there?
No. This is a really good question. I mean, they'll limit our access. As an industry watchdog, we actually had some inspectors on the ground before the melamine problem reared its ugly head. These people withdrew. In fact, we had 2 sets of independent, nonprofit inspectors. They weren't necessarily experts in terms of agriculture. They were normally inspecting workplace environments. But both groups of inspectors withdrew because they were afraid of their own personal safety. They couldn't get near these facilities. It's even worse. Now, you're a consumer of organic food.
Yes.
We appreciate that. The farmers that are members of the Cornucopia Institute and the farmers that are certified under the USDA accreditation program are visited every year by a USDA accredited certifier. The USDA supervises directly these certifiers. So there is this third-party oversight, and then you've got nonprofit public interest groups watching the corporations and watching the government officials. That doesn't happen in China. There are no USDA, there are no U.S. certification agencies. All the USDA certification happens by foreign certifiers, mostly from Europe. They can't even go unencumbered and inspect these farms. They have to be accompanied by a Chinese certification entity. The farmland is actually owned by the state, not by the individual farmers. It's a whole different animal over there. And the individual farms are not even being certified as our farms here are, as a separate farming operation where their procedures are very intimately reviewed and scrutinized. Instead, because of the cumbersome mechanism, it is so expensive to certify farms over there, like a couple $1,000s, that most of these very small agricultural producers are certified under a group or an umbrella certification through the exporters. So it's a bastardization of the entire system that organic consumers in this country are willing to pay a premium for. I think you used the term Orwellian. Was that
Yes.
you, Representative?
Yeah.
You know, this is Orwellian, that families are seeking out a safer and more nutritious food supply that they trust, and it's coming from this low level of oversight. And you asked about the competition that we face. Our farmers, our entrepreneurs, our processors, our high-integrity businesses are facing this unfair, uneven playing field because we jump through these hoops. It's expensive. We have to document everything we're doing on farms and processing plants. That's not happening in China.
I want to say one thing. I actually toured a catfish farm in China, and I had the PLA there very close to me. It was owned by, people don't realize it, but the military actually owns a lot of the industries over there. And it was alarming to me to the degree at which they controlled it, and we were given limited access. And I can just say, though, I'm puzzled. Why do you think you're not, well, two questions. Excuse me, Chair, if I go over a little bit. But should we block all imports of food until we get access? And two, why do you think that the national media isn't picking up on this? It's alarming that they're not.
Sure. Well, first of all, I think as a food consumer, and I think we all are, I would like to see Congress demand of our regulators that imported foods meet the same high standards, the same level of inspections. I mean, just because it's coming in on a container, why should there be less oversight? If we can afford to do it, they can afford to do it in other countries, either through a creditable inspection service that we recognize reciprocity, which doesn't exist in China, or by our own inspectors. But short of that, do you want to entrust your children, your grandchildren's health and future and well-being to some economic interests that, again, this has been referenced more than just by my testimony. We have endemic levels of commercial fraud in that country, superseding just the food industry. Why should we trust somebody who's robbed us 20 times that they're going to operate in an ethical manner going forward, trust and verify?
Excellent. Yes?
Thank you.
Just on the topic, I mean, one issue that we deal with as a consumer advocacy group is a little bit of almost fatigue on food safety news, and I think that's part of what's happening. But to your question about, to let these products in or not, we're now very dependent on certain things. When you have, one country like China is producing 80% of the world's vitamin C, and you shut them down, products won't get made, right? So that's one factor in this, is a reluctance to not have some of these products made. I mean, one very specific example we're dealing with right now is the FDA has been tracking for several years reports of illnesses in mostly dogs, and it seems to be tied to a specific type of treats made of chicken. They're like chicken jerky treats, and they're sourced from China. They can't quite figure out the problem, and this has been going on for years. And it will get occasional local media. People will cover it as a local story. This tragic thing happened to a local pet owner, but it hasn't really risen to this thing. It's been going on for several years. There is a China connection, and at several points last year when FDA went to plants that were making some of these ingredients, they were not allowed to take samples. They could take samples, but they couldn't send the samples to labs in the U.S. to do the testing. So that was a real breakdown in our regulators' ability to figure out what's going on. So, you know, that gets covered almost as a local story, a very personal story, but there's a much bigger story there about our system not being able to deal with this, and where we're dependent on, you know, the companies doing a voluntary recall. We haven't seen FDA block this.
Yeah, I remember the national media got upset with the dog food thing. I was surprised that all the dog food was made in China at one place, even though you paid $10 for this bag, $2 for this bag, came from the same shop. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my overtime use that I...
We have some time, and if you want more time for a second round, we can. If we are expecting to have a vote very shortly. Let me just ask you some, as I say, batting cleanup here. You mentioned vitamin C. 80% of the world's vitamin C comes from China?
Yes. And so,
there you go.
You know, it's ingredients.
Is there any question that some of the vitamin C may not be up to standard?
I mean, that's an assumption on our part. I
Yes.
can't prove that to you, but I'm assuming that there's some problems based on the track records we've seen in other sectors.
Do we know if I'm...
Don't get a chairman, Mr.
Right here it is. My multivitamin for every time I have a meal, and the vitamin C's in there. Do I know where that vitamin C is coming from?
No, I mean, we don't get this level of information as consumers.
So the American consumer, if some of us are concerned about the standards in China, we don't know that we are consuming something from China, and that's not on anywhere near on the label, right?
It may tell you what country it's made in as the processed food, but it's not going to go down every ingredient.
Can I add, Mr. Chairman?
Go right ahead.
That besides for those supplements that you're shaking,
Yes.
that vitamin C ascorbic acid is a very, very common food ingredient in processed food. So if you read the fine print where those little novels are on the side of a food package, that's in there. And so there was some
But it
mention.
doesn't say where it's coming from.
No, it doesn't.
It
So
just says vitamin C's in there, fine, but I personally go out of my way to try to not buy products in China because I have concluded, that's one of the reasons we were holding this hearing, is because the chairman has concluded that there are some major questions that need to be answered and some challenges that need to be met before we can trust our putting things into our body or into our family's body that might be harmful.
industry has fought like hell against country of origin labeling cool. We would really encourage this body and all members of Congress to defend the rights of the American public to make informed choices in the marketplace. Not only do I not want to buy Chinese food in my household, I want to reward the businesses in the United States that employ people at fair wages, that meet pollution and other regulatory standards, that meet other labor standards. And I can't do that in most of the food I buy because the processed food, as Patty was stating, is not required to be labeled.
I actually shop a lot for my family. I mean, I like to shop. And I know I'm going to shock everyone here, but I really like to go to the 99-cent store. Okay? So I go to the 99-cent store, and you have all of these labels that are sounding so American. I mean, Honey Hill and Aunt Martha's this, and, you know, all of these things that sound just so down-home American, and then you look real close, and little tiny print, it says China on it.
It's even worse than that. You have brands like Chicago Pneumatic that makes tools, They're from China. I mean, maybe there's a town called Chicago in one of the provinces there, but I don't think so.
Or as the one that used to be, there was the, they changed the name of a city in China to USA, USA, and so they could print on it, made in USA. And, well, we are up against what I consider to be a very, how do we say, an adversary that is seeking benefit in a way that will put our children and our families at risk. And we need to make sure that there are people in our country, of course, who are making a profit by dealing with those who are putting us at risk. And I think that we need to make sure that, number one, labeling means something, and that I'll give you one example. This in my area, there's a gentleman who runs a paint and coating company, and he used to sell all the paint for Mattel dolls. And I happen to have two daughters who are 9 years old, and I know what little kids do with dolls. They kiss little dolls. And when the Chinese bought Mattel, or bought the rights, or Mattel decided to contract with the Chinese came to his company, and he described how he had to make sure he had the right kind of paint that would not be at all risky to the health of the consumer of that doll. And they, sure enough, then they decided to go forward with their own formula, and Mattel dolls, after about a year, were found to have lead paint. And so you have all these little kids kissing their doll, thinking, and with Americans having trusted Mattel, a very trusted, label, and not to do something like that, but those children are being put at risk because Mattel had decided to manufacture in China. And by the way, that situation was cleared up. Only because it took a huge fight, and it took a great amount of spotlighting the issue, and for that to happen. I think this has been a very good hearing. And now, do either of you have another question you'd like to throw up? I think we could have a second hearing.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes,
Mr. Chairman, I just want to say something quick. I think we on this panel probably have both conservatives and liberals, and we're in a general agreement. And I think that's an unusual circumstance where we have this concerns from both sides of the aisle and both different philosophies. And again, I can't stress enough, I think somehow your organizations need to announce it, that this hearing occurred, and the things that you said, and with us also stating it, maybe we'll generate some interest, because this is a very serious issue. And it's alarming that everything that we read now on the labels, in fact, may not be true. And that's what we rely on, those labels. So again, thank you for the hearing, Mr. Chairman.
Right, well, I'll end it with this. Obviously, from what we have heard today, the American people are facing a threat, a major threat to their well-being. Their health, the health of their families could be in great jeopardy, and this could be, and they could be put in jeopardy. They may be being put in jeopardy by, number one, unscrupulous people who are making money dealing with people in China who are not doing anything up to the standard that we expect here in the United States of America.
Can I interrupt to add one more thing, Mr. Chairman? I'm sorry,
sir. Go right
riffing off of what you're saying, because I think you're spot on.
Go right
I think we need to hold the businesses in this country that are doing the importing responsible as well, because they are, again, part of this dynamic that places really responsible food producers in the United States at a competitive disadvantage. I'll use one example. Eden Foods in Clinton, Michigan.
Say it again. What
Eden Foods in Clinton, Michigan. You asked about Walmart Organics. The canned beans at Walmart, whether they're pinto beans or black beans, they come from China. Eden Foods buys not from some broker with a piece of paper, but from farmers that they've dealt with for generations in North America, mostly in Michigan, but some in the Plain States and Canada. They know the farmers. They're a little bit more expensive, but they're operating at a very high ethical level. We need to protect those kind of investors and entrepreneurs, and that means that we need to hold responsible everybody in the supply chain. If somebody comes in from China at 30% cheaper, we need to find out why, and those businesses need to do their due diligence. And if they can't inspect, if they're not allowed to go to that factory or those farms, they shouldn't be doing business there.
Well, step number one, it seems to me, is for us all to agree, Republican and Democrat, that we believe the consumer has a right to know what they're buying and has a right to know what country of origin they're coming from, because consumers may or may not want to deal with what would be, even if it was not healthy, maybe they want to deal with slave labor for countries that don't permit unions or don't permit their workers to earn a decent living. And maybe there are people who are nationalistic who just want to buy from the United States of America and fellow Americans. That's fine too. Maybe they're willing to buy a little bit more or pay a little bit more. And so we can all agree that we as Americans have a right to make the decisions in our lives based on a free flow of information and accurate information, and that right now that is not happening. And in fact, will be the fact that we've got threatening foods coming in that could do harm to our families suggests to us that the American people are being betrayed by a compromise of standards and someone's making a lot of money at it. Somebody's making a lot of money at it, and I certainly believe that we should be holding the corporate interests, the individuals and the corporations that that are pushing for this and bringing food over that may or may not be safe, and are fight. And by the way, they're the same ones when we start talking about labeling. You can bet that these are the folks who've been fighting it behind the scenes the whole time. It's like when I always complain about the companies that go over to China, and then the corporate leaders say, well, it's not our job to watch out for the security of the United States. That's your job. You pass the laws, and we'll have to obey them. Until then, we're going to invest wherever we want for the benefit of our company. Except they don't add that their company then spends a lot of money on lobbying to make sure that we don't pass any laws that prevent them from doing business with a dictatorship that's the world's worst human rights abuser in the world. So we've got our work cut out for us. This is a very good start in the discussion, and I do plan to hold another hearing on this sometime in the near future.
Mr. Chairman, I have a request if you do. Could we bring the officials from the silk company before the committee?
We can ask anybody to come here that we would like.
I'd like to put Mark and them on the same panel.
Mr. Chairman, one last thing to pick up on the distinguished gentleman's point. We have the names of products, and we know people are making a lot of profits. That's exactly what you said. But we don't have the names of who those people are. If, God forbid, we should have a disaster here, stopping all trade is all we have. We don't know who the corrupt officials are. We don't know yet who the people are who are engaged in this. And to the extent that we can gain some information from the administration, task the administration to find the names, that's useful. I think the Congress did a very good job of naming some Russian officials, you remember, very recently. This is legislation you all did, and it caused a big impact in Russia. You could cause a really big impact in China if you named names or threatened to do so. And that would mean, oh, gee, I can't go to the United States. I can visit my money, and I can't send my kid to college, all of this kind of thing in the United States. If you begin with the basic data of who the perpetrators are, I think that would be a very useful thing for the committee to do based on the Russian experience.
Right.
Thank you.
Well, transparency and accountability are two essential ingredients if we're going to have freedom and be able to have decent lives and have any security in our lives at all with freedom. Freedom means that you're going to have some choices. Freedom is going to be people doing things that you're not totally in control of, but you should be in control of your own decisions. So with that said, I want to thank the panelists for opening up this area of discussion. As I say, I think we'll probably have another round of hearings on this sometime in the months ahead. but I think we've started the national dialogue, which is important. This hearing is adjourned.
Doesn't make you want to go eat them.